So, any of y'all have small children? So, my 10-year-old, she likes to send stuff with me on my work trips, which is usually a stuffy, as she calls them. And so, it depends on the trip what I get. And so, this time she said, "Well, I want to send somebody with you to help." I said, "Okay, well, who's this?" So, this is a character from Octonauts. His name is Pawnee, and he's a hydrologist. I said, "That's the one to take this. So, if you ask me a question that I cannot answer, I'm going to defer to Pawnee, and we'll go from there." So, all right. Appreciate y'all for being here. Travis, thank you for having me. Uh, I know there's some staff and officials from Corpus Christi, so appreciate y'all being here. Want to talk about a citywide drainage master plan that we are in the process of wrapping up. We've done the technical work. Portions of this have been completed and approved. Some of these things are pending. So I'll try to be clear on what has and has not been approved. When we get to the topic of impact fees, just know that those are draft and those have not been approved. So I'll probably say that 4 more times. All right, so again, we're just going to give a background about Corpus Christi and then kind of walk through the overall stormwater master plan. Y'all have gone through a lot of hydrology and hydraulics today. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but just really to talk about how we use different applications for different scenarios. Talk about how we went through developing our capital improvement projects for the city. We're not going to walk through every specific project, but if you have questions, we can talk about those. And then we will have some discussion about the impact fee process and how that works and what we've done to date. So we actually worked on a comprehensive master plan for the city, which included water, wastewater, roadway, and stormwater. So my portion was just a stormwater portion. So this is just kind of one of the 4 legs that we worked on. Within the stormwater plan, it was really kind of a side-by-side analysis. One, which we won't get into much today, is kind of the code review. So the city has some old draft manuals. They've got newer infrastructure design manual, the IDM. Some of the portions of there match, some of those don't exactly. And so part of this is making recommendations for that code. But then the bulk of our work was with the actual H&H analysis itself, so that we can address old city problems, put together an approved CIP that can help enable growth, and then can work towards funding. All right, so the method varied the method of the H&H analysis varied based on where we were in the city. We looked at issues today, existing conditions, a 10-year build out, and then fully to ultimate conditions. We identified what for the city of Corpus we called PMAs, or potential mitigation areas. Those are they may be called damage centers or risk areas, depending on what community you're in. But basically, if we say PMA, we're talking about the areas of town where something is apparently at risk today. We'll talk about how we rank those PMAs based on structure flooding and roadway flooding, and then how we develop the capital projects from there. Corpus Christi, which y'all have heard all about Nueces County a lot today, but there's been pretty healthy growth through the city throughout its history, but that growth has slowed down since the 90s or so. The exact source of what the current growth rate is varies based on who you ask, but it is lower than some of the other cities of its size in Texas and across the country. Over the last few years, and COVID kind of created a hiccup there, but the average growth rate is somewhere around between 1% and 2%, 1.3%, I think is where we looked at. But part of the plan, and these specific percentages they're more important for the water, roadway, and wastewater discussion than they are stormwater. But not only do we look at citywide what that growth rate was, but how it broke down by area development plan. And then we looked at data from the MPO and information that the city had and that TxDOT had as far as the changes in trips. And then we coordinated that with the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee, or what we call SEAC. So the SEAC is it's a body it's an appointed body appointed by the city leadership that helps guide the process of developing a master plan and developing impact fees. And we went through piece by piece and ADP by ADP to agree on what was a generally acceptable percentage of growth for those areas. All right. The city is broken up into, I mean, you can break it up, carve it up a number of different ways. But we looked at a few different areas. So we've got the downtown area, which is sort of in the kind of that darker green area, which is, we modeled that separately. Go through here. Actually, we'll start with Oso Creek. So Oso Creek, which has been talked about and what Mr. Hinojosa just asked about, it is mostly undeveloped. A lot of the watershed is actually in the city's ETJ. There is some mixed development out there, and there's some infrastructure, but usually it's in the form of ditches, bridges, or culverts. There's not a lot of underground storm drain systems. Downtown is this dark green area. It's pretty much built out. There is a pump system downtown that gets water over the seawall when it's needed. And then we've got the areas down at the island where there is some development and some infrastructure, but that area is dominated by storm surge. Flower Bluff was looked at separately. We've got, it is mostly developed. There is some infrastructure, but it doesn't function as like the rest of the city because there's not really a riverine component. It's just kind of a bluff. And then the rest of this is Nueces River Basin, Corpus Christi Bay Basin, and Oso Bay Basin. This is the area that is mostly developed and has a lot of underground storm drain infrastructure. So that's how we carved up the project on how we were going to attack the analysis. And so we used different models. So for the Oso Creek Basin, we used HECRAS. We used a 1D, 2D analysis so we can look at the flow through the creek, but then also the overland areas. For the downtown area, we used the NXP swim model. That specifically was used because the city already had an XP swim model for that area, and we were just updating it to take into account the new Atlas 14 rainfall. Next area is down here in Flower Bluff, where there's less infrastructure. We used the rain on grid RAS 2D, which is basically just treating the surface like a grid and how the water flows through. We actually ended up confirming a lot of that with our ICM model. And then from there, the rest of the area, we use an InfoWorks ICM model. The reason we did that is because that area is, of course, very flat, but there's a lot of underground storm drain infrastructure. Some of it is looped. A lot of it goes out below some of it, the outfalls are below sea level. So it's a very complicated system model. In general, we prefer to use the readily available, publicly available models like HECRAS, but sometimes, like in this case, we've got to use some of the more advanced systems that are proprietary. But so we used a combination of those to best fit the city. And now understand, this is a large city with a big ETJ. All of this is scalable. So if your total city is 2 square miles, a smaller version of this can be done. And as other consultants have shown, this can be extrapolated to larger river basins like the Nueces River Basin. A little bit about the inputs that go into the studies. So the topography in Nueces County and Corpus Christi is relatively flat. We were actually surprised to find out that there's pretty good terrain up here up towards Cal Island. But unless you're in the creek or right next to the creek, it's generally just water flowing from field to field and kind of just being guided by TxDOT's bar ditches. The soils through here are predominantly clay. The purple means clay here throughout the entire city, the exception being the island and Flower Bluff are of course sandier. We talked about the land use, the growth percentages assumed earlier. For stormwater, we were less concerned about the percentage of growth and really just looking at what are the assumed values for the current state of development, future development, and ultimate development. And so we started with existing land use. So we did 2 things. We took the city's zoning data, and then we compared that with aerial photography, and where there was zoning that wasn't apparently developed based on the aerial imagery, we kind of took that out and developed this existing conditions land use. This green color that you see is just undeveloped through most of the Oso Creek watershed. The proposed land use, we basically said, well, we need to look at a 10-year proposed land use condition. The reason that we picked 10 years is because that's the time period that's used for the impact fee calculations. So the impact fee is intended to support development or growth over the next 10 years. And so we looked at, we had to make an assumption of kind of a snapshot. And so we said, well, we'll just assume that the zoning map within the city limits is the projected 10-year development. And then we also added a few areas that we knew there were some developments coming online through plat data and things of that nature. Now you might ask, well, what happens if we're over or under on our estimates for the land use? How does that affect the fee? When we get to that, it really doesn't matter for stormwater because it's all about like dollars per acre, dollars per square foot of impervious cover. So if the actual growth rate fluctuates more or less than what we projected, it doesn't really affect the rate. It just affects the amount of fees that would be taken in over that amount of time. For future land use, we did a few things. We looked at some of the corridors where we saw some different, commercial and industrial development coming in. We saw some denser residential areas coming in here. We plugged those in where we had, a good idea of what was coming. And the rest of the area, we just considered mixed use, which is, I want to say 95% residential, and then a mix of other things. There are some areas, large green areas like the tip of the King Ranch down there, where we safely assume that there's not going to be much development. And then we broke the city up into service areas. There are 8. These red lines are each service areas. There are somewhat broken up by watershed, but we also combined watersheds just for kind of accounting purposes. We ended up with 8 or 9 once we added the islands for service areas. For the discussion of the impact fee, only one of those service areas really matters, and that's the Oso Creek watershed, which we'll talk about more. Talk about how we got to the potential mitigation areas or the damage centers. First thing we did is when we met with the city and started our modeling is we want to do a high-level analysis. So we did a 2D rain-on-grid analysis of the entire city. We also did this for Flower Bluff and the island, but just for I just want to put one exhibited up here. But so this is assuming just the topography and no underground storm drain infrastructure. So this is very conservative. The point of this was to be able to print out a big layout, sit down with staff and say, okay, does this make sense with what you've seen? You guys deal with the calls and the issues of closing roads. Do these areas that show the deepest flooding, does that make sense? And so you went through and say, well, yes, this one makes sense, but there's the pump system here. This one makes sense, but TxDOT's got a project. And so this was just a tool that we were able to model the entire city very quickly, kind of, like I said, as a first sniff test. As we went through iterating and refining our models, we had to figure out what was the level of risk that we were going to quantify. So the first thing we modeled was 100-year floodplain, period. So whether or not it was an inch of water or 6 feet of water, we just counted what all was inundated. And what we found is that when it rains, there's water all over Corpus. And even when we talked to the stakeholders and we talked about, well, should we take into account a foot of flooding in the roadways, kind of got chuckled at and said, well, that's a pretty decent rainstorm. Maybe let's bring that down so we're not counting so many structures. So we went through and we looked at different options. We said, well, we can look at a 100-year storm. We can look at a 10-year storm. And instead of looking at the inundation of the entire floodplain, maybe let's truncate that to a certain depth. So we looked at only counting the structures who might be flooded when there's 6 inches of water, and then only counting the structures that might be flooded when there's 12 inches of water, and which is what we landed at. We landed at what we call the 10-year 12-inch, which is not a design storm. It's just a way to count structures that are potentially at risk. And so you'll see some maps later where we'll have some dots on parcels or structures, and that is what's counted there. Now, each community can set their own level of risk here. What's important is that we had a defendable, agreeable metric so we could say, here's the number that we're counting for structures. If you wanted to make this the 5-year or the 50-year, you would have the same type of metric. On the roadways, we didn't look at a specific metric for flooding of this depth over a lot of time. But when we looked at our modeling, we looked at areas where there was a road flooding, and that road flooding might be improved if there's some infrastructure added. So this was kind of a manual assessment. And then we looked at areas where, to determine whether or not they were controlled by storm surge. So want to clarify that the 12-inch depth issue. So if this is, and this is just from FEMA's website, their standard, picture that says this is a floodplain and this is floodway. And this is this is me being a 10-year-old drawing houses in the floodplain. So if this blue line is the actual floodplain, we looked at, well, what happened if for the houses that are touched only by 6 inches of flooding? Well, when we do that, we're basically narrowing the width of what we're counting. So if the 100-year floodplain is this wide, we say 6-inch flooding, we're going to count fewer houses. And if we go to 12-inch flooding, it's going to count fewer houses and structures there. A reasonable question would be, why did you do that? Why did you choose 12 inches? So since we were looking citywide, we did not have finished floor data for all of the houses. So the code today calls for houses to be up well above the curb line, and it's generally acceptable for even the 100-year storm to go up into a lot as long as the structure isn't damaged. So to count every house in the floodplain would probably be overestimating the structures that are actually potentially in danger. But we didn't want to take this to 18 inches, which is more in line with the code. So we said, well, we will just count them at 12 inches as just a representative number. We did look, one of the things when we started talking to the stakeholders about the projects that we were developing, one of the comments was, well, we don't really show any projects down on the islands or even on North Beach. And we said, well, that's true, but what we're looking at with this master plan are projects that can help reduce that risk number. And this is just straight from the FEMA maps. You can see the flooding on North Beach and on the islands, that all this is really dominated by storm surge. That is not to say that there can't be a maintenance type project by the city that can help with some of the day-to-day flooding. That's still very important. But for the scope of this project, creating a large-scale CIP for the overall city, that was all just beyond the threshold of what we were looking at. We also did we talked about the rain on grid study. We did that first for Flower Bluff. All these little rectangles are just first identifications of PMAs, and this is just in Flower Bluff, and we ended up with, the first time we counted 30-something PMAs. And this is looking at existing conditions without storm surge taken into account. And when we added storm surge, there's areas along the coastline of Oso Bay or the Laguna that just aren't necessarily solvable with a standard channel and culvert project. And so, we identified, well, that means that there's some areas that we're not going to be able to help with this project. And taking into account the storm surge also changed the dynamics of the actual studies for the kind of more internal projects that we're looking at. We spent a lot of time on our InfoWorks ICM model. We broke this up into 15 zones. There's nothing really magic about the number of zones there, except that a lot of the way this works is we would spend all day getting the model set up, and before we leave the office, we run, because some of them run for hours and hours, and you hope that the system doesn't twitch while that's going on. So there's definitely some reruns when we got back. So we just broke these down so that each version could run within an hour or two. And that got better as we went through that. We talked about needing the ICM model because of all the infrastructure. So we got the city's GIS data for the storm drain systems. So all those green and yellow pipes are the storm drains. I believe there's a threshold on the size of the pipe. That's the different colors. But the city data had about 38,000 pipes in it. And there were about 8,700 manholes and inlets that we had to account for. We worked through, and by we, I mean Anthony Shepis, who did most of this work, um, went through and consolidated pipes as best we could so that we had the same length of pipe, but basically cut that in a fourth or so to get down to 8,000 pipes and about 5,000 nodes. A lot of that GIS data is not always based on survey. So we've got situations where sometimes pipe look like they're running in negative directions. So where we had as-builts to verify, we did. But honestly, some of the slopes are so flat that some of the pipes probably are running backwards in some areas. So we just cleaned it up as best as we could to make sure that the models were stable. When we put all that together, it's kind of zoomed in. That's what it looks like. The blue lines represent a pipe. The green lines represent a node, either a manhole or an inlet. And with this modeling, we basically calculated the water in the watershed, and we basically started the water in the pipe. And when the pipe no longer had capacity, it shows that it overflowed. And that's how we estimated the flooding. For our surface area, we used 2D zones. With this program, those are triangular zones, and that basically represents the slope of the land. And those, we assigned roughness and soil data to each of those zones. And then we had to take into account the houses. There are hundreds of thousands of structures in Corpus Christi, and so we took the footprints from the appraisal district data, and we basically extruded those up out of the surface to be 10 foot tall. And so what that does is it's a conservative way to show that when the water, if it were to touch this building, it would go around it instead of through it. So, which in reality, in a flood, the water would go through. But again, this creates a conservative approach. Talk about identifying PMAs. So we've got the blue represents the 10-year storm where there's 12 inches of flooding, and the black is all the building footprints. And so we went through, and if the building footprint touched that delineation, we counted it. If for some reason we didn't have a building footprint, if the center of the parcel was within that flooding, we counted it, and that's how we got our existing condition structures. And this is just zooming out a little bit to see, we ended up with a lot of structures counted just kind of on the southeast edge of town. As we started putting went through several iterations of doing improvements. The first thing we did was very simple. We said, you know what, we've got, the way the model runs, it says there is one 48-inch pipe. And it's really easy to say switch 1 to 2, or 2 to 4, or whatever it is. So our first sensitivity analysis was, let's double the size of the storm drain to see where it makes a difference. Easy check. That was not our final analysis, but it was a way to just kind of, again, do a quick check with such a large watershed. And then from there, we massaged it and iterated it. What the yellow represents is where our proposed improvements reduce the flooding from existing conditions to proposed. And so in areas where there was a little bit of improvement, it may not warrant a project, but in areas like this where there's larger improvements, it would. Here are examples of some of the projects that we did come up with, and these tie into the quad sheets that we developed for the city. We've got channel improvements along one of the parkways, and culvert and storm drain improvements are in black. And you can see in this case, we switched. There was time between these two exhibits. We switched colors. So purple are areas that were flooded but no longer flooded. Here's an example of a kind of pretty big system that could be broken up into multiple smaller systems. So this is a channel system that runs southwest down to Oso Creek, and then some of the culvert improvements that can be made, culvert and storm drain improvements, and you can see some changes in flooding there. And then this is another set. We had to take into account improvements around TxDOT. We've got some storm drain improvements. This actually drains to the north and goes towards downtown. With this type of situation, we made sure and put our improvements into our other models where we look at things like the downtown pump stations to make sure that we didn't add too much water to the system and have an adverse impact. Now, we've heard a lot about some of the riverine flooding. Talk a little bit about the Oso Creek flooding. So the Oso Creek, and this is there's a single gauge on Oso Creek, and that dark blue line represents the flood stage, which is considered a major storm. And since 2015, there have been 4 or so major storms, that shouldn't have happened that many times within the last 10 years. But you can see there's a lot of storms recently that have caused some issues. We looked at the overall Oso Creek watershed first as one large watershed, and then we broke it down into smaller pieces, and then smaller and smaller pieces into really 3 different levels. The gauge, I guess it didn't show up there. The gauge here is in this area, and we use that gauge analysis to validate, calibrate our flows to make sure that what we were calculating was within reason to the actual gauge measured 10, 50, 100-year storms. When we're setting up our Oso Creek analysis, again, most of the infrastructure out there is just ditches and bridges and culverts. We didn't have money to survey on any of the structures, so we used a program called Eagle View. It's a subscription-based software program, really a website where you can actually measure vertical distances and areas on vertical planes. And so you can get kind of these isometric views of these bridges and come here and say, all right, that's about 15 feet. Now, it's not survey accurate, and it's hard. There's a point where it doesn't really work well on tiny outfalls, but it's a good way to gauge whether or not the models we're working with are in reason and what we needed to actually go field check. Our modeling for Oso Creek, actually, this project was going on right after the AECOM pilot study that was going on. So that model was what was used as our baseline for this Oso Creek study, and then we expanded. We went into a little bit more detail with some of our crossings and structures from there. Oso Creek, generally speaking, very capital general here. Generally speaking, under existing conditions, the creek has capacity to convey the 10-year storm without causing much damage. All the major TxDOT crossings through here are typically sized at 10 years as a 10-year storm, and so those, everything works pretty well there. But when we get to the 100-year storm, you see there's a lot more flooding, and you start to get issues at the bridges, and this is in existing conditions. When we were kind of validating, or really validating, not calibrating storms, we overlaid our flood limits and then started looking for just whatever we can find, data related to some storm events. And this isn't exact, we don't know the exact time that this happened, but we were able to say, you know what, this tree on this corner is this tree on this corner, and that matches up pretty well with what we were modeling. What we saw when we started looking at the hydraulics, the patterns from the hydraulics in Oso Creek is that the portion of the creek that's within the city, the developed area, gets to and through the creek in about 18 hours. The portion of the creek that is outside of the city, it takes about 30 hours. So that means that developed water basically gets through the creek into the bay before everything upstream. So where this is important is, one of the questions was with the code side, how do we handle detention? Well, the city's IDM already says that you can't increase flow or you can't impact your downstream, neighbor. And so this reconfirmed that in the undeveloped areas, moving forward, there needs to be detention with that development. This is, again, just a snapshot of the existing conditions analysis. We've overlaid these green lines, which are the proposed projects. And then when we rerun existing, we ran it with those proposed projects, which are generally basically just channel improvements. There's a major reduction in flooding. So these channels, all these green lines, they were sized to take into account a fully developed watershed where there was detention in place. And most of these look like, big excavation or dredging projects. Now, the discussion about you have to have a plan for maintaining those projects, that is very true. The city actually recently got funding for the Oso Creek bottom rectification, which is the bottom 12 miles of the channel. And part of that, is going to dive deep into the actual design of those improvements. In that, we got to look at, what are we going to do? What's the maintenance plan moving forward to make sure that, the city spends this money that it got from the Water Development Board. Let's make sure that the money was put to good use. Now, again, we ended up with, we started out with dozens and dozens of projects and then whittled down to 29 projects. Each of these projects could be broken down into much smaller projects. So 29 could easily be 100 or 150, however you wanted to break them down. 24 of those are in the developed areas, and then there's 5 large projects in the undeveloped areas. One thing else I wanted to point out is that there was also the Tri-County study going on at the same time as our study, which was Nueces, Jim Wells, and Clayburgh County. And so we talked to the Nueces County engineering consultant, and we heard it from city staff. They heard it from county staff and leadership that says, hey, we realize there's 2 overlapping studies. Please, let's try to do this efficiently. So we met regularly with those engineers to coordinate our studies. And so geographically, there was overlap in our studies. But when we both said, hey, here's a project, we divvied that up to make sure, okay, if it's in the city limits, Pape-Dawson will take care of it. If it's outside of the city limits, half will take care of it. And that was kind of how we divvied it up. A good example of that is this project here. You can't read the number, but that dashed yellow area is called Nueces 28. That's an area that the county identified, that we identified, and sure enough, TxDOT is already working on plans to bridge that floodplain. And so, we pretty cleanly said, okay, the city project will be east of Crosstown, the county project will be west of Crosstown, and TxDOT's project will be Crosstown. So it was a way that the communication actually worked out. Now, for each of these, we developed what we call a quad sheet, which this is I believe this prints out to 11 by 17, just basically a summary document. So this is what we call the Oso 1 project. It lines up with the Oso Creek project that is now already funded. And this is just kind of a guidance document that helps the budget process that's got all your vital information. So it's got the thick line of where the project is. It says this is this many feet of proposed channel, this wide. It's not a construction drawing, but it just lets us know what's going on. It's got a brief description of the project. We've got the council districts listed, the precincts listed, and some possible funding sources that could go, that could fund this in the future. And then we've got our cost estimates, basic construction, right-of-way, mobilization, contingency, design, and inspection, all to kind of a bottom line. And we did this for each project. This is in the undeveloped area. This is one from the more developed area. We've got a combination of storm drain and channel improvements. And this is also a smaller project compared to that other one. This is about $10 million, but again, could be broken up into smaller $1 million, $500,000 projects. Each of these got its own cost breakdown. For that large undeveloped project, it was a very simple estimate because it really is a matter of excavation. And then we've got some standard percentages assumed for utility adjustments and things like that. Where we get into the developed areas, it gets a little more complicated because we're looking at different pipe sizes. There's more need for trench excavation protection, flowable backfill, things like that go into those estimates, right-of-way acquisition, but we did this for each of the projects. Here is the full, geez, that's a big spreadsheet. These are the full list of projects. So we ended up with, again, 29 projects ranging from, say, $6 million to $60 million, with a total of $697 million for the CIP. So the 29 projects and the costs associated with them, these have been approved. They were approved this spring. This dollar in no way locks the city into spending any money. It is a number there for planning purposes so they can move forward with funding as needed. And again, these projects can be broken down. We also looked at the risk and the cost versus the risk, or the cost benefit. And so we had those inundated structures existing and proposed. And we narrowed that, the number of structures that we counted to only where there was 12 inches of water. So that's why these numbers are in the hundreds and maybe not in the thousands in some areas. And then we just ranked them basically take the dollars, divide by the reduced risk, and that's how we rank those projects. And these are the 24 projects within the city developed area. The 5 projects here are the ones in Oso Creek. These are the ones that are dependent on development, and these 5 are the only projects that we used for our impact fee analysis. So those 5 projects totaled $143 million. When if you don't have impact fees and you're implementing impact fees, the state has guidelines about what portion the city can pay, what the burden on the developers. And so there's a couple different ways to do it. The simple way is that when we start our impact fee calculations, we take this total number and we divide it by 2. And so the project cost is $143 million. When we step into the impact fee discussion, we divide that 2, it's about $70 million. The impact fee process starts with all the planning that we talked about, the analysis that we've done, the policy for establishing the impact fee that we have worked on. And when I say establishing, I mean calculating, and now we're in the adoption. So the impact fee it's received a recommendation for approval from SEAC with some conditions. We're now going through public workshops. We met with Planning Commission last week or 2 ago, and council is next. And so we'll work through that so that we can hopefully get to an adopted fee. So you've seen this number already. Take this 143 divided by 2, and that's your numerator. And then we convert the land use assumptions that we did into impervious cover, so concrete, rooftops, pavement, and that is your denominator. You take your dollars divided by impervious cover, and you end up with an estimated fee. We looked at different options, and I'll just kind of flip through these. The first option was, by state law, the impact fees have to be collected collected and used within their service area. And generally the service area for drainage is within the watershed. So option 1 was, let's make Oso Creek one big watershed, one big service area with 5 projects. So it's just dollars divided by impervious cover. The SEAC is a committee that's a mix of folks. Some are developers, some are not. So we have very varying opinions on there about where the fees should be. And so when you start talking about how to divvy up the service area, you start looking at questions of equity. Well, if we have too many service areas, are we now making fees too costly in one area? If we have one big service area, are we subsidizing the cost across the entire service area? And those are really policy decisions, but we looked at some options. So 1 is just one service area. 2 is one service area with just a delineation, so for everything collected north of here goes to projects north of here, everything collected south of here goes to projects south of here. And the third option is actually breaking this down into multiple service areas, and to say, okay, everybody pays for OSA 1, and then some people also pay for 2, some people pay for 3. And we end up with different cost options. So our option 1, which is our dollars divided by impervious cover, ends up being a little over $30 per 1,000 square foot of impervious cover, which equates to about $100 and some change per residential lot. Summarizing what that looked like with our recommendations to SEAC is, again, our first recommendation was option 1, $30 per 1,000 square feet. Option 2 was that, but with the collection zones. Option 3 varies. and that fee would be between $10 and $40 per service area. We ended up going with the recommendation of the single unit, the single service area, which is about $100 per equivalent residential unit. Here's that big draft to be crystal clear. This has not yet been approved by council. When we presented that to SEAC, they made their recommendations, and they wanted to simplify some things. So one, instead of it being $100.20, they said, let's just call it $100, and let's just say $100 per residential lot. And so that was what was recommended. Instead of having a per impervious cover, it was just per lot, which was a recommendation. And that is what is moving forward as a recommendation to council. Compared that to different other cities, so we're at about $100 per lot. City of Portland is higher than that. Port Aransas is higher than us. It's proposed, but the range is expected to be $200 to $500. We're similar to Willow Park and a little higher than Houston. And so it kind of depends very much where you're at in the state with what that looks like. And with that, we've talked about, we going through the entire H&H process, and we ended up with an approved CIP that has 24 projects the city can use to plan for bond programs and year-to-year CIP. We've got these 5, what we call master thoroughfare channel projects that guide the impact fees. We confirmed the detention requirement for developments, and then we gave impact fee estimations. And then one thing that I want to point out, so the impact fees will go to council in, I think, the 3rd week of July. Should those get approved, state mandates that there is a 12-month period between the time that the fees are adopted and the time that they're implemented. A lot of that has to do with, the policies that go along with it, which the city is working on. There's time to sort that out. You got to build runway in the development process and make sure if there's other city processes that they can be adjusted. We're actually extending that time based on input from the SEAC, so it'll be closer to 15 or 18 months to push that out for adoption and implementation. And with that, open any questions.
First, anybody any questions from the audience? Before I started with reading the list. All right. So on the quad sheet, the bottom center of the block says that potential funding sources are impact fees and bonds, where other funding sources considered, such as low interest loans, grants, etc.
So they were. We didn't dive deep into the specifics of those, but where they made sense, we did say this is an area you could get state or federal funds. We didn't identify specifics.
Okay. How did you get land cover data from aerial imagery?
So we used the National Land Cover data set to start, and then aerial imagery, we just did a visual assessment. So we had our techs looking at it for big areas to make sure that it made sense.
Okay. How did you estimate for hydraulic conductivity of urban soils?
Oh, that's a question for Pawnee. No, so we, I didn't do the modeling. No, no. So we used that based off of where the city had any guidance in their draft manuals. We used that. Where we didn't have that information, we looked at other studies and used similar values with similar soils from Houston or things of that nature.
Okay. This one is a caveat that you may not have the answer for, but this may be a city question. But what is the status of the Oso Creek dredging project? Where did the funding come from? And what is the status of the core permit?
So I will take a stab at it, and Gabe can jump in if I miss something. So that project, the Oso 1, which is the Oso Creek project, that is under contract. Hance is the prime. We're working with them on that project. So the funding source was the Water Development Board, Clean Water, Rotational CWSRF fund. So it actually has a water quality component too. So that's that's the funding source. We are just getting started with the engineering feasibility report. So right now, one of the team members is looking at environmental constraints. So the core permit has not started yet, but that's going to be part of what the EFR does, is outline which projects we can reasonably do, and part of that's going to be with the funding, or excuse me, the permitting and the permitting timelines.
Okay. Is there any other questions from the audience? We're about at time. I've got a handful here, but is there any of questions that really need to be answered, or we're going to be running out of time here shortly? If you have a question that we didn't answer, I think a lot of these are city questions, not Pape-Dawson questions. So I'm not going to send them to them, but if you have questions, come to me and I can get you with some city staff.
And real quick, I did want to, I appreciate the shout out from Longhorn about the Aggie baseball team, but I will disagree with Judge Canales about who taught us to fight for your right. That is the Beastie Boys, not Taylor Swift. So that's all.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Jake.